What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most recognizable family names didn't fall because of scandal, but because of blood? Not rumors, not a career-ending interview, not a leaked tape. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. But a crime scene, a quiet, gated estate in Brentwood, a place designed to keep the world out, a place where flashing police lights were never supposed to reflect off marble floors and manicured hedges. And yet, on a Sunday night, they did. 2 bodies, a family shattered, and a verdict so devastating that one daughter would later collapse in open court. This is not just a story about murder. It's a story about loyalty turning toxic, about secrets that didn't stay buried, and about a question that haunts every family touched by tragedy. What if the danger was already inside the house? Stay with me, because the truth behind what happened to the Reiner family is darker, more complicated, and more disturbing than the headlines ever suggested. And by the end of this, you may find yourself asking a question you never expected to ask about justice, guilt, and silence. Because this story doesn't begin with a knife. It begins with a warning. Let's rewind. For decades, the Reiner name represented stability in Hollywood. Legacy, respect. A family that seemed to have figured out how to survive fame without imploding. While other dynasties collapsed under addiction, scandal, or ego, the Reiners appeared different. Grounded, private, almost untouchable. From the outside, they were the example people pointed to and said, "See, it's possible to have it all and not lose everything." But what the public never saw was what happens when pressure builds quietly, when resentment has nowhere to go, when family dynamics twist behind closed doors, far from cameras and red carpets. Because the most dangerous stories aren't the loud ones. They're the ones whispered inside a home no one is watching. On a calm Sunday evening, that illusion of safety shattered. Authorities would later confirm that Rob Reiner, 78, and his wife Michelle, 70, were found stabbed to death inside their $13.5 million Brentwood estate. No signs of forced entry, no chaotic struggle throughout the house. Just a scene that suggested something far more unsettling. Someone didn't break in. Someone was already there. Imagine that for a second. Imagine realizing that the walls you trusted, the locks you relied on, the sense of security money supposedly buys, none of it mattered. Because danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it shares your last name. Reports indicate the bodies were discovered by the Reiner's daughter, Romy, just 27 years old. A moment no parent ever imagines their child experiencing. A moment no child ever recovers from. Picture that walk through the house. The silence, the wrongness in the air, that instinctive feeling that something is off before your brain catches up. And then, the discovery. There are moments that split a life into before and after. For Romy, that was it. But what happened next would raise more questions than answers. Because according to reports, Romy didn't just call for help. She allegedly told police something chilling. That there was a dangerous family member. Someone who, in her words, should be a suspect. Let that sink in. In the immediate aftermath of discovering your parents brutally murdered, your mind barely functioning, your world collapsing, and yet, one thought is clear enough to say out loud. Not a stranger, not a burglar. Family. Ask yourself honestly, could you do that? Could you point investigators toward your own blood? That single statement changed everything. Because once those words were spoken, the investigation stopped being about who got in and started being about who never left. Police quickly focused their attention on Nick Reiner, the couple's 32-year-old son. He lived on the property, in a guest house just steps away from the main residence. Close enough to hear things. Close enough to come and go unnoticed. Close enough to be involved. That same night, Nick was arrested. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The news spread fast. Hollywood froze. Fans were stunned. Industry insiders whispered. And the public reaction followed a familiar pattern. Disbelief, speculation, outrage. But if you think that's where this story peaks, you're wrong. Because this case wasn't finished unraveling. Not even close. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors began to suggest something that shifted the narrative entirely. Nick may not have acted alone. And that's where Tracy Reiner enters the story. The sister, the one no one expected. The one whose name wasn't trending at first. The one who would later face an unthinkable verdict and collapse when it was read. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about arrests and accomplice theories and courtroom breakdowns, we need to understand something crucial. This wasn't a random explosion of violence. This was a slow burn. Families don't implode overnight. They fracture over time. Through silence, through denial, through the unspoken rules that say, we don't talk about that. And when you add fame into the mix, those rules get stronger, because reputation becomes more important than resolution. Appearances matter more than healing, and problems don't disappear. They just wait. The Reiner estate wasn't just a home. It was a symbol, a fortress, a place that represented success, privacy, and control. But symbols can lie. Behind closed doors, even the most beautiful homes can become pressure cookers. And when pressure has nowhere to escape, it finds a way out. Sometimes violently, sometimes legally, sometimes in a courtroom, when a verdict lands so hard that the human body physically gives up. And that's what makes this story so unsettling. Not just the crime, but the implications. Who knew something was wrong? Who stayed silent? And at what point does loyalty become complicity? Because one sister spoke up, another allegedly didn't. And the consequences were irreversible. As this case moved forward, it forced a terrifying question into the spotlight. If someone in your family was capable of something unthinkable, would you see it? Or would you convince yourself you're wrong? Because the alternative is too painful to accept? By the time the truth began to surface, it was already too late for Rob and Michelle Reiner. Too late for the family they once were. And too late to stop the chain of events that would end with one sibling behind bars, and another collapsing under the weight of a verdict that changed her life forever. But none of that makes sense without understanding the family itself. The legacy, the relationships, the cracks that were forming long before police ever arrived at that Brentwood gate. Because before the arrest, before the trial, before the collapse, there was a family everyone thought they understood. And almost no one actually did. They say legacies are built in public, but destroyed in private. And if you want to understand how a family like the Reiners could end up at the center of something so horrific, you have to start long before the crime scene tape, long before the sirens, long before a courtroom would one day fall silent as a verdict was read. You have to start with the image, because the image is what fooled everyone. For decades, the Reiner name carried weight. Not just fame, but credibility, respectability, stability. In an industry known for chaos, excess, and implosion, the Reiners appeared almost immune. While other Hollywood families burned out spectacularly, this one endured. They didn't air their conflicts publicly. They didn't feed tabloids with drama. They didn't collapse under scandal. At least, not on the surface. And that surface-level calm is exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Because when a family that appears solid suddenly fractures in the most violent way possible, the instinctive reaction is to ask, how? But the more important question is this: how long had it been breaking? Hollywood has a strange relationship with family. Fame magnifies everything. Success amplifies pressure. And privacy becomes both a shield and a weapon. Inside powerful families, silence is often mistaken for harmony. And that's where cracks hide. The Reiners were deeply private. Interviews focused on careers, not home life. Public appearances were controlled. Conflicts, if they existed, stayed off camera. That's not inherently suspicious, until something goes wrong. Because when tragedy strikes a family that has shared so little, the absence of visible warning signs becomes suspicious in itself. Ask yourself this: how many families truly know what's happening behind their own closed doors? Now add money. Add influence. Add a home so large that family members can live on the same property and barely cross paths. That kind of environment doesn't force confrontation. It avoids it. And avoidance is fertile ground for resentment. Reports would later describe the Brentwood estate not just as a residence, but as a compound. Main house, guest house, space, distance, privacy within privacy. That layout matters. Because proximity without connection can be more dangerous than separation. When you live close enough to observe, but far enough to disengage, problems don't get resolved. They get watched, judged, internalized, and eventually, they explode. Family dynamics are complex even without fame. Parents age. Children grow into adults. Roles shift. Expectations clash. In families with legacy, those tensions multiply. Who lives where? Who depends on whom? Who feels overlooked? Who feels controlled? These questions don't go away just because a family is wealthy or well-known. In fact, wealth often intensifies them, because money can keep people together long after emotional bonds have fractured, and it can create power imbalances that quietly rot relationships from the inside. By the time police entered the Reiner estate, investigators weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were stepping into years of unspoken history. History that wouldn't be visible in interviews or red carpet photos. History that only reveals itself when something breaks. According to reports, Nick Reiner had been living in the guest house on the property, not across town, not in another state, on the same land. That arrangement alone raises questions. Why was he there? For how long? Under what circumstances? Living on a family property as an adult can mean many things. Support, transition, struggle, dependency, control. None of those are crimes, but all of them shape dynamics. And dynamics matter. When investigators began reconstructing the family's internal structure, they weren't just asking who had access. They were asking who had friction, who had motive, who had been watching silently, and who had been seen as a problem long before anyone called the police. This is where Romy's alleged statement becomes impossible to ignore, because pointing to a dangerous family member doesn't come out of nowhere. That kind of accusation suggests fear, concern, history, something that predates the night of the murders. You don't suddenly decide your sibling is dangerous in the worst moment of your life unless that thought already existed somewhere in your mind. Which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if there were warning signs? What if concerns had been voiced privately but never escalated? What if people chose peace over confrontation until peace was no longer an option? Families often operate under unspoken rules. Don't embarrass the family. Don't bring outsiders into internal matters. Don't call attention to problems that can be managed quietly. Those rules are even stronger in high-profile families. Because once something becomes public, it never goes away. But silence has consequences. And sometimes, silence is interpreted as permission. As investigators pieced together the Reiner family timeline, they weren't just analyzing movements. They were analyzing relationships. Who spoke to whom regularly? Who avoided whom? Who was included? Who was isolated? Isolation is dangerous. It breeds narratives that go unchecked. And when someone feels unheard, unseen, or controlled, their perception of reality can warp. That doesn't excuse violence, but it does explain how violence can feel justified in the mind of someone spiraling. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is how ordinary the lead-up appears to have been. No public meltdowns, no explosive interviews, no visible dissent. Just a family living quietly behind gates. Which means whatever was happening, it was happening out of sight. And that's where the idea of legacy becomes twisted. Because legacies create pressure to perform roles. The successful patriarch, the supportive spouse, the accomplished children. When someone doesn't fit neatly into that image, tension grows. And tension, when ignored, becomes something else. Resentment, anger, detachment. The kind of emotional distancing that makes unthinkable actions feel possible. As prosecutors would later suggest, the story of this crime may not be about a sudden snap. It may be about a slow erosion. A family that stopped talking honestly, stopped intervening, stopped believing something could go truly wrong. Until it did. And when it did, the response wasn't unified. One sibling spoke. Another would later be accused of staying silent. And silence, in this case, may carry its own weight. This is what makes the Reiner case so difficult to process. It forces you to confront a terrifying truth. You can love your family. You can protect your family. And still be part of something that ends in catastrophe. Because love doesn't automatically create accountability. Sometimes it prevents it. As the investigation moved forward, one thing became clear. The story wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that happened before it. Every overlooked warning. Every avoided conversation. Every moment when someone thought, this will blow over. And it didn't. The Reiner legacy wasn't destroyed by a single act. It was weakened by years of silence that left it vulnerable. And when the pressure finally found a release point, it didn't just claim 2 lives. It pulled an entire family into a nightmare that would play out under the harshest lights imaginable. Because once police decided the threat may have come from inside the family, there was no going back. And the next chapter wouldn't be about legacy. It would be about evidence, arrests, and a son who lived just steps away from where his parents would be found dead. No one expects the place they call home to become a crime scene, especially not a mansion designed to keep danger out. High hedges, security systems, a gated driveway tucked into one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Brentwood isn't just expensive, it's insulated. It's the kind of place where people believe the worst things in life happen somewhere else. Which is exactly why what happened inside the Reiner estate sent shockwaves far beyond Hollywood. Because this wasn't chaos spilling in from the outside. This was violence unfolding in a place built on control. And that distinction matters. The Brentwood property wasn't just a house. It was a carefully constructed environment. A main residence. A detached guest house. Enough distance for independence. Enough proximity for oversight. From a distance, it looked ideal. In reality, it created something far more complicated. When police later described the scene, one detail stood out immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. No obvious struggle throughout the property. That single fact narrowed the investigation instantly, because it suggested access, comfort, familiarity. Whoever was responsible didn't need to break in. They already belonged there. And once investigators realized that, the entire tone of the case shifted. This wasn't a random act. It was intimate, calculated, and deeply personal. The estate itself became a silent witness. Every hallway, every doorway, every locked or unlocked entrance. Investigators began reconstructing movements, not just from that night, but from days before. Who came and went? Who was expected? Who wasn't? In high-profile homes like this, security logs matter. Cameras matter. Patterns matter. But patterns only tell you so much. Because even the best security system can't detect intent. And intent is where this case gets unsettling. According to reports, Rob and Michelle Reiner were found inside the main residence. The manner of death was described as stabbing, a method that immediately raised red flags for investigators. Stabbings are personal. They require proximity, force, repetition. This wasn't distant. It wasn't detached. It suggested rage, or panic, or something that had been building long before that night. And that realization changed how detectives viewed the layout of the property. The guest house, Nick Reiner's living quarters, close enough to reach the main house quickly, far enough to offer privacy. A setup that, in hindsight, felt almost ominous. Ask yourself this. If someone lived just steps away, would anyone notice them leaving in the middle of the night? Would anyone question footsteps they'd heard before? Would anything seem out of place? This is the danger of familiarity. It normalizes movement. It hides abnormal behavior behind routine. That's why the lack of forced entry wasn't just a clue. It was a warning. Someone knew the house. Someone knew the rhythms. Someone knew how to move without triggering suspicion. As investigators mapped out the property, they weren't just tracing physical routes. They were tracing relationships. Who had keys? Who had codes? Who had unrestricted access? In wealthy households, access is often assumed. Family members don't knock. They don't announce themselves. They move freely. And that freedom, in this case, may have been deadly. The guest house wasn't an afterthought. It was a critical piece of the puzzle, because it placed Nick Reiner in a unique position. Not a visitor, not a tenant across town, but a constant presence, living within the orbit of his parents' daily lives. That proximity raised difficult questions. Had there been recent conflict, arguments, tension that neighbors couldn't hear? In estates like this, sound doesn't travel the way it does in ordinary homes. You can scream inside a mansion and still go unheard. Privacy cuts both ways. As the investigation unfolded, detectives reportedly focused on the timeline. What time did the parents last communicate with anyone outside the home? When were lights last seen on? When was the last confirmed movement? These details are mundane. Until they aren't. Because in cases like this, minutes matter. A single gap in the timeline can point to everything. And that gap often exists where no one is watching. The estate's isolation wasn't accidental. It was designed. But that design created blind spots. Blind spots where actions could occur unnoticed. Blind spots where family dynamics could escalate without interruption. This is where the idea of safety becomes an illusion. Money builds walls, but walls don't build trust. Inside those walls, people still argue, still resent, still struggle. They just do it quietly. Neighbors later described the area as peaceful. No reports of disturbances. No obvious red flags, which only deepened the mystery. Because violent crimes don't usually happen in a vacuum. They are preceded by something. Tension, instability, fear. And yet, from the outside, everything appeared calm. That calm is deceptive, because some of the most volatile environments are the ones that look the quietest. Investigators began to ask themselves a troubling question. What if the absence of noise wasn't a sign that nothing was wrong? What if it was a sign that something had been wrong for a long time? In high-profile families, conflict often goes underground. Problems are managed internally. Help is avoided. Intervention is delayed. Because once something becomes public, it's permanent. But when problems are managed quietly, they can metastasize. And when they finally surface, they do so violently. The Reiner estate became symbolic of that reality. A place meant to protect the family from the world may have protected the family from accountability, too. As police processed the scene, each detail reinforced a chilling narrative. This wasn't impulsive chaos. This was controlled access. And controlled access points to someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who felt comfortable there. Someone who didn't fear being questioned. Because when you belong somewhere, you don't expect suspicion. That sense of entitlement can be dangerous. It can blur moral boundaries. And it can make lines easier to cross. As detectives worked through the night, one truth became unavoidable. The answers weren't going to come from outside the gates. They were inside the family. And the estate itself had quietly narrowed the suspect pool to a handful of people, one of whom lived just steps away. The house didn't just witness the crime. It framed it. It constrained it. And it silently pointed investigators toward a conclusion they didn't want to believe, but couldn't ignore. Because once you eliminate forced entry, once you eliminate strangers, you're left with something far worse. You're left with familiarity. And familiarity, in this case, would lead police directly to a son whose presence on the property could no longer be explained away. But as investigators closed in, they still didn't know who would ultimately be held responsible, or how many people might be involved, because the estate kept one more secret, a timeline that didn't quite add up, and a discovery that would come not from security footage, but from a daughter walking into a silence she would never forget. And what she would say next would redirect the entire investigation. Because the crime scene didn't just reveal what happened. It revealed who Romy believed was capable of it. And that belief would change everything. That's exactly what happened to Romy Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter who reportedly discovered the unthinkable. Her parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, brutally stabbed to death inside their Brentwood estate. The moment is almost impossible to put into words. Think about it. The house that once symbolized security, family, and legacy suddenly becomes a crime scene. Every familiar hallway, every piece of furniture, every memory, tainted. And the person walking through it first isn't a detective, isn't an investigator, isn't even a neighbor. It's a child. Reports indicate that Romy didn't just stumble upon the tragedy. She immediately understood the gravity of what she saw. Shock and disbelief gave way to instinct. But what she reportedly did next would haunt the investigation and the family for years to come. According to sources, Romy alerted police and, importantly, allegedly mentioned that there was a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Take a moment and let that sink in. In the middle of absolute personal trauma, in the moment your parents' lives have been violently taken, your brain is still sharp enough to identify a potential suspect. And it's someone with whom you share blood. The gravity of that statement cannot be overstated. It reframes the entire investigation. Suddenly, the focus is no longer on burglary, robbery, or an unknown intruder. It's inside the family. No longer is this just a homicide. It's a family in crisis. Investigators had to process what Romy's claim implied. Someone inside the home, someone trusted, someone who had intimate knowledge of the family's routines, relationships, and secrets, could have committed the crime. Someone who had lived in the same environment, walked the same halls, and shared the same history with the victims. And in families, history is everything. The investigators began to probe deeper. How had this alleged dangerous family member behaved in recent weeks, months, years? Were there prior disputes? Were there warning signs that might have been overlooked? Because in almost every case like this, hindsight reveals patterns that no one paid attention to in real time. According to reports, Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son, was living in the guest house on the property. He wasn't just a visitor or a distant relative. He was on the estate, within steps of the main house, with access to the family members. Investigators quickly began piecing together his movements and interactions that Sunday night, as well as any prior incidents that could point to motive or opportunity. What makes Romy's alleged observations so chilling is not only the accuracy it suggested, but also the emotional burden it carried. She had just experienced the worst possible loss, the violent death of her parents. Yet, in that moment, she was essentially forced to navigate suspicion within her own family, to distinguish between grief and reality. No one is prepared for that. The psychological toll must have been immense. Walking into a crime scene is traumatic enough. Identifying a potential suspect, someone you love, someone you grew up with, adds layers of complexity, fear, and guilt. It raises a question that lingers over every high-profile family tragedy. What do you do when the danger is already inside? Investigators faced the same dilemma. They had to act quickly but cautiously. Romy's statement provided direction, but it also had consequences. Accusing a family member, particularly in a case involving the children of famous parents, is explosive. Every step had to be meticulously documented, every claim cross-checked, every possible angle considered. As police continued their investigation that night, the focus inevitably shifted to Nick. He was living on the property. He had access. And now, according to Romy's report, he had to be considered a person of interest. The sequence of events is both methodical and terrifying. Discovery, call to authorities, initial interviews, and eventually, arrest. Nick Reiner was taken into custody that same night, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest alone stunned Hollywood. News outlets raced to cover the story. Social media exploded with speculation. The public, accustomed to scandals and lawsuits, struggled to comprehend a tragedy that combined wealth, fame, and unthinkable violence. But for the family, the shock was personal and immediate. Grief, fear, confusion, compounded by the suspicion that the threat may have come from within, created a tense, emotional environment. And amidst that chaos, the rest of the family had to navigate their own responses, media intrusion, and legal proceedings. And then there was Tracy Reiner, the sister, the one whose involvement no one initially anticipated, the one who would later face a verdict so devastating that it caused a physical collapse. But before we get there, it's important to understand the weight of Romy's discovery. Her actions didn't just reveal a crime scene. They set in motion an investigation that would unravel a family's private life in a public way. Every decision, every recollection, every statement mattered. Every word she spoke had consequences. Not just for the accused, but for the surviving family members and for the entire legacy of the Reiner name. And while investigators were following procedural steps, the emotional dimension of the discovery could not be understated. Imagine being Romy. Your parents are dead, your brother is a suspect, and your every word is scrutinized. The stress, the fear, the internal conflict, almost unimaginable. It's not just a crime story. It's a human story. One that begins with a single moment of discovery, a daughter walking into her family home and seeing what no child should ever see. And that moment would echo through every subsequent step: arrests, charges, trials, verdicts. Because in cases like this, discovery is more than a first step. It is the hinge upon which everything else turns. And as the investigation deepened, one chilling truth became clear. The Reiner estate had not only witnessed the crime, it had framed the narrative. From that point forward, every detail mattered. Every testimony mattered. Every family dynamic mattered. And no one could predict what would happen next. But what came next would shock the family, the courtroom, and the world, and set the stage for one of the most dramatic legal and emotional collapses in recent Hollywood history. Chapter 3 complete. Go. No one expects a son to become the focus of suspicion in his own family. Yet that's exactly what happened with Nick Reiner. At 32 years old, he wasn't a distant relative or a visitor. He lived on the property, in the guest house just steps away from the main residence. A presence that, until that fateful night, had probably felt completely ordinary to everyone. But proximity can be dangerous. Familiarity can breed suspicion. Investigators immediately began reconstructing Nick's movements. They traced when he was last seen, when the parents were last confirmed alive, and who had contact with whom throughout the day. Every small detail mattered. Every conversation, every text message, every interaction became a potential clue. And the closer someone is, the more scrutiny they face. Living on the estate, Nick had access to the main house. He knew the rhythms, the routines, the habits of his parents. Security cameras wouldn't capture intentions, and doors that were usually locked might have been left ajar. Investigators looked at motive, opportunity, and means. Could there have been long-standing tension in the family that escalated behind closed doors? Had there been prior arguments? Or financial disputes? In high-profile families, these conflicts are often hidden from the public eye. But they don't disappear. They simmer quietly, sometimes for years, until they find an outlet. Nick's arrest that same night sent shockwaves through the community. The charges, 2 counts of first-degree murder. It was a headline that no one expected, not in Hollywood. Not for a family whose name had long symbolized stability and respectability. But for the Reiner family, it was just the beginning. While Nick was being processed by law enforcement, questions began to swirl. Could someone act alone? Or was this part of a larger pattern? Could a sibling or another family member have been involved? And that's where Tracy Reiner's name started to surface. The sister, the one who had previously stayed out of the spotlight. The one whose life and public persona seemed removed from the chaos now unfolding. Reports suggested she may have had knowledge of, or even involvement in, aspects of the crime, something that would later bring her into the legal spotlight. At first, the public narrative focused solely on Nick. But investigators, following leads and examining relationships, began to realize that the family dynamics were more complicated than anyone had anticipated. And then there was Romy's statement about a dangerous family member. Suddenly, the scope of suspicion widened. For investigators, the focus shifted from a single suspect to the web of family relationships that may have contributed to the tragedy. For the family, the fear was palpable. Imagine knowing that someone you've grown up with, someone you've shared holidays with, could be capable of such violence. And for Nick, the implications were immediate. He wasn't just facing legal consequences. He was confronting the public judgment of a world that had watched his family from afar for decades. The arrest alone changed the trajectory of everyone involved. Careers, relationships, reputations, all in jeopardy. And the legal process had only just begun. What made this situation even more complex was the question of motive. Investigators explored every angle: financial disputes, personal disagreements, and underlying psychological issues. Every clue had to be weighed against years of family history, with the understanding that the truth might be more disturbing than anyone wanted to accept. And as legal proceedings loomed, the next layer of the story revealed itself. Tracy Reiner, the sister, who had remained in the background, was now implicated in ways that no one expected. According to reports, she was later arrested and found guilty of being an accomplice. The charges suggested that she could face consequences equal to those of her brother, a revelation that shocked everyone who thought they knew the family. This case was no longer just about a crime scene or a tragic night. It was about a family unraveling under scrutiny, each member forced to confront not just the legal ramifications, but the emotional reality of betrayal, suspicion, and guilt. The Reiner estate had been a safe haven. That illusion was gone. The very people who once felt secure within its walls now faced scrutiny, suspicion, and legal jeopardy. And for Tracy, the ordeal would culminate in a courtroom moment that would leave her physically collapsed, overwhelmed by the verdict. But before we get to that, it's essential to understand how a family's internal dynamics, secrets, and unspoken conflicts can escalate to such a tragic point. Because this wasn't just a story about a son arrested. It was a story about how hidden tensions, proximity, and silence can converge to create a nightmare that no family ever anticipates. But in the case of the Reiners, it became something else entirely. It became a battlefield. From the moment the trial began, tensions were high. The public wanted answers. The media wanted spectacle. And the family was trapped in a space where personal grief collided with public scrutiny. Opening statements set the tone. Prosecutors laid out a narrative that was both methodical and chilling. A crime committed in a private estate, evidence pointing to Nick Reiner, and indications that the family's internal dynamics could not be ignored. Defense attorneys countered with arguments about motive, opportunity, and reasonable doubt. They questioned whether Nick acted alone and highlighted the lack of prior criminal behavior. But no argument could mask the emotional undertone that permeated the room. Witnesses took the stand. Each testimony added layers of complexity to a story that already felt impossible to untangle. Friends, neighbors, family members, all painting fragments of a life that, from the outside, seemed orderly, but from the inside, had its fractures. The prosecutor asked questions designed to provoke not just facts, but emotion. Did you ever see tension between Nick and his parents? Were there arguments that escalated? Had anyone expressed fear about what might happen? Each answer built a picture of a family under pressure, one where conflicts may have simmered unnoticed, only to erupt violently. Observers noted the strain on the Reiner siblings. Romy, who had discovered the scene, gave testimony that was careful, measured, and emotionally heavy. She described the moment she walked into the house and the instinctive reaction that led her to suggest a suspect, a family member. Tracy, the sister, sat quietly, absorbing every detail. Every mention of her family, every accusation, every implication. And as the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that her role would not remain peripheral. Evidence of communications, movements, and possible omissions emerged. The prosecution began to suggest that Tracy's actions, or inactions, may have facilitated the events of that night. The defense argued that circumstantial evidence could not equate to guilt. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a theater of human emotion. Gasps, whispered reactions, and visible strain punctuated every session. For viewers following the case, it was a mix of intrigue and horror. For the family, it was trauma replayed publicly. And then came the emotional spikes, the moments that no one could anticipate. Witnesses breaking down, unexpected admissions, contradictions in testimony. And through it all, the Reiner siblings were forced to confront not just legal arguments, but the devastating implications of familial betrayal, trust, and responsibility. The media painted a narrative of a family collapsing under its own weight. Commentators speculated, public opinion formed, and the lines between legal fact and sensationalized story blurred. But within the courtroom, the law demanded precision. Every claim had to be substantiated, every timeline verified. And yet, the emotional atmosphere was undeniable. The jury was tasked with separating grief, shock, and family dynamics from evidence, an almost impossible job in such a charged environment. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension was palpable. The jury deliberated. The family sat in anxious anticipation. The courtroom felt suspended in time, each second stretching unbearably. And then, the moment arrived, the reading of the verdict. Nick Reiner's fate was announced. The legal consequences crystallized. The room was silent, but the weight of the decision was visible in every expression. And then attention shifted to Tracy. Her name, her actions, her alleged involvement, all came into focus. Reports indicated that when the verdict against her was read, she collapsed. A physical manifestation of shock, grief, and the realization that her life had changed irrevocably in an instant. It was a moment that captured the intersection of legal judgment and human emotion. The verdict was more than a legal outcome. It was a tangible force that physically and emotionally overwhelmed someone directly involved. In that courtroom, the consequences of silence, loyalty, and inaction were laid bare. The trial had not only determined guilt or innocence, but had exposed the emotional cost of decisions made over years. Decisions about when to intervene, when to speak, and when to remain silent. Observers described the scene as heartbreaking, almost surreal. A courtroom, a place of rational procedure, transformed into a stage where human fragility was laid bare. This trial wasn't just about what happened on that tragic night. It was about the accumulation of unspoken tensions, unresolved conflicts, and the ways in which private grievances can become public catastrophes. And as the legal process continued with sentencing looming, the Reiner family was left to confront a dual reality: the public verdict and the private devastation. The moment Tracy Reiner collapsed in the courtroom was more than just a reaction. It was a physical manifestation of the weight she carried. Every heartbeat, every intake of air, seemed to echo the gravity of the situation. For years, she had lived in the shadow of a public family legacy, and now, that legacy had become a nightmare made tangible. Reports indicate that the courtroom went silent. Gasps and murmurs filled the air as people processed what they were seeing. Security personnel and court staff quickly moved to assist, but the emotional impact of the moment had already reverberated far beyond the walls. Cameras caught the scene, but no lens could capture the full extent of what was happening inside her mind. To understand the collapse, it's important to consider the multiple pressures Tracy was under. First, the familial shock. Losing her parents in such a violent way is incomprehensible under any circumstances. Second, the legal reality. Being found guilty as an accomplice meant she could face consequences as severe as her brothers. Third, the public scrutiny. Every glance, every whisper, every headline painted a picture she couldn't escape. Humans are rarely equipped to process simultaneous layers of grief, fear, and societal judgment. Collapsing in that moment wasn't weakness. It was an involuntary response to extreme emotional trauma. Her body responded to the enormity of the situation in a way that words alone cannot convey. Yet, even as she was helped to her feet, the courtroom remained tense. The legal machinery kept turning, questions still needed answers, and the implications of the verdict rippled through the family and the public. Her collapse became symbolic. The human cost of legal proceedings, the tangible weight of moral and emotional responsibility, and the destructive force of familial betrayal. Observers later described the scene as harrowing. It was a stark reminder that while the law can assign guilt and punishment, it cannot measure emotional devastation. No statute can alleviate grief. No court order can undo trauma. Tracy's collapse also highlighted a deeper narrative within the Reiner family, the consequences of silence. For years, small conflicts, subtle resentments, and unspoken tensions may have existed unnoticed or unaddressed. In high-profile families, the pressure to maintain appearances often suppresses confrontation, creating an undercurrent of unresolved emotion. When tragedy strikes, those undercurrents surface with devastating effect. From a psychological perspective, being accused of complicity in a crime committed by someone you love creates an unparalleled cognitive dissonance. The human brain struggles to reconcile loyalty to family with the acknowledgement of wrongdoing. That internal conflict can manifest physically, as it did for Tracy. The courtroom, meant to deliver rational, impartial justice, had become a stage for a raw and undeniable display of human fragility. The verdict was more than a legal pronouncement. It was a moment that exposed the emotional stakes for every family member involved. Outside the courtroom, public reaction was intense. Social media erupted with speculation, debate, and often uninformed commentary. News outlets replayed footage, analyzed expressions, and attempted to explain a moment that defied simple interpretation. For the Reiner family, there was no escaping scrutiny. Every move, every emotion, every expression was cataloged and judged. And yet, despite the media frenzy and public attention, the most critical reality remained inside the family. The personal consequences of a tragedy that unfolded within their walls. The collapse was a reminder that legal outcomes, while definitive in the eyes of the law, intersect with human emotion in unpredictable ways. This chapter of the story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. Justice is not always neat. Accountability carries a human cost. And when familial bonds are entangled with crime, the consequences extend far beyond the courtroom. As the Reiner family processed the verdict and its implications, one question lingered. Could anything have prevented this sequence of events? Was it a result of a single moment of violence, or a culmination of years of unspoken tension, proximity, and miscommunication? What comes next in this story isn't just the sentencing or the legal aftermath. It's the long-term impact on a family's legacy, the emotional aftermath of public scrutiny, and the broader lessons about trust, accountability, and the consequences of silence. Chapter 6 complete. Go. The Reiner family tragedy didn't end with the courtroom verdict. In many ways, that was only the beginning. The sentencing phase loomed, carrying with it the weight of consequences that would alter lives forever. Sentencing in high-profile cases is never purely procedural. Every detail is analyzed, every prior action considered. For Tracy Reiner, the stakes were enormous. The charge of being an accomplice meant she could face penalties as severe as her brothers, including potential decades behind bars. But beyond the legal ramifications, the emotional and psychological strain continued to intensify. Families under public scrutiny experience grief on multiple planes. There's the personal grief of losing loved ones, the societal grief of judgment, and the layered complexity of guilt, loyalty, and shame. For the Reiners, each of these combined into a nearly unbearable emotional load. Witnesses in the courtroom spoke to Tracy's relationship with her parents and her brother, attempting to establish context, history, and character. But character testimony can only go so far when the facts of a crime are damning. The prosecution emphasized the role of knowledge, complicity, and the alleged failure to prevent or report involvement, framing Tracy's actions, or inactions, as integral to the sequence that led to tragedy. Observers noted a recurring theme: the ways in which high-profile families, despite their outward appearances, often harbor hidden tensions. For decades, the Reiners maintained a public image of stability. Privately, though, relationships were complicated, sometimes distant, sometimes fraught with unspoken resentment. It's a familiar pattern. Families that appear perfect externally often struggle internally, particularly when proximity, wealth, and expectations intersect. The Reiner estate, with its main house and guest house, exemplified this dynamic. Proximity created opportunities for oversight, but also allowed resentment and conflict to fester quietly. Tracy's sentencing was preceded by testimony, psychological evaluations, and legal arguments. The court considered whether her involvement was active or passive, voluntary or coerced, knowing or negligent. These distinctions matter legally, but they also carry profound emotional weight. As the judge prepared to deliver the sentence, the atmosphere in the courtroom was taut. Family members, legal teams, media representatives, and onlookers all waited in anticipation. The sentence would not only determine Tracy's future, but also serve as a stark marker in a family narrative that had already been irreversibly fractured. When the sentence was finally announced, the room reacted with a mix of shock, relief, and disbelief. For Tracy, the pronouncement carried immediate emotional consequences. Media reports indicate that she required medical attention shortly thereafter, underscoring the physical toll of both the trial and the sentencing process. The public reaction was equally intense. News outlets dissected the verdict and sentence, often focusing on the dramatic courtroom moments. Social media commentary ranged from outrage to sympathy, illustrating the spectrum of public engagement with high-profile legal cases. For the Reiner family, this meant ongoing exposure, scrutiny, and judgment, even as they navigated private grief. But what's most important to understand is the long-term impact of such events on family dynamics. Legal outcomes are finite, but emotional consequences persist. Trust, loyalty, and familial bonds are tested in ways that often have no resolution. The Reiner case exemplifies how a single event can reveal underlying fractures, turning what was assumed to be a safe and private family environment into a public and painful saga. The consequences of violence, complicity, and silence extend far beyond the immediate crime, influencing relationships, reputations, and personal well-being for years to come. For Tracy, for Nick, and for the surviving family members, the aftermath of the sentencing marks the beginning of a new reality, living with the consequences of tragedy, public exposure, and legal judgment. It is a reality in which the past cannot be undone, and the future must be navigated carefully, with awareness of the fragility of family bonds and the weight of decisions made in silence. And yet, even as the courtroom drama concluded, one question lingered. How had things escalated to this point? Could the tragedy have been prevented? Or were the pressures, tensions, and unspoken conflicts simply destined to collide in the most devastating way possible? The answers lie not just in evidence or testimony, but in the emotional, psychological, and relational dynamics that had been quietly shaping the Reiner family for years, dynamics that, once unleashed, proved both unstoppable and irreversible. After the courtroom had quieted and the verdicts were read, the Reiner family was left to confront a stark new reality: life after tragedy. But for a family of such prominence, private grieving was no longer possible. The media, social platforms, and public fascination ensured that every emotion, every movement, every decision was under scrutiny. For Tracy, the aftermath of the trial was compounded by her physical and emotional collapse. Witnesses and reports described her as fragile, overwhelmed, and struggling to process both her parents' deaths and her own legal consequences. Psychologists later suggested that this type of trauma, grief intertwined with guilt and public exposure, is particularly intense, often leading to long-term psychological effects including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. The family's dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Nick was incarcerated, facing charges and public condemnation. Tracy was grappling with her role in the events and the consequences that came with being found guilty as an accomplice. Romy, who had discovered the crime, faced survivors' guilt and the complicated emotional burden of having identified a suspect within her own family. Each sibling had to navigate their grief, legal implications, and the intense media attention simultaneously. Outside the family, Hollywood and the public reacted with a mixture of shock, fascination, and moral judgment. Analysts debated motives, dissected past behaviors, and speculated on family dynamics that might have contributed to the tragedy. The media's coverage transformed a private family disaster into a case study in human psychology, privilege, and the dark consequences of silence and complicity. Therapists and family counselors emphasized that such cases illustrate the complexity of familial relationships. Wealth and proximity can intensify pre-existing tensions. The Reiner estate, with its separate guest house and sprawling grounds, may have allowed resentment and isolation to grow unchecked. Private grievances, minor conflicts, and unspoken disappointments can fester, sometimes culminating in catastrophic events. The aftermath also raised questions about public perception versus private reality. For decades, the Reiner family had cultivated an image of stability and accomplishment. But the events revealed that external appearances can be profoundly deceptive. A family that seems harmonious may, behind closed doors, harbor tensions and dangers that are invisible to the outside world. Legal and emotional consequences intertwined. Even as court procedures concluded, the psychological weight remained. Families in these situations often experience ongoing trauma, strained relationships, and long-term challenges in rebuilding trust. For the Reiners, the shadow of that fateful night lingered in every interaction, every family decision, and every public appearance. One of the most striking lessons of this tragedy is the cumulative impact of silence and avoidance. Problems that are ignored, arguments that are suppressed, or conflicts that are left unresolved can intensify over time. In this case, the family's dynamics, combined with proximity and access, created conditions that ultimately led to a violent outcome. The Reiner tragedy also underscores the unpredictable consequences of intervention, or the lack thereof. Romy's identification of a dangerous family member may have directed investigators and influenced the legal outcome, yet it also introduced immense psychological strain for her and her siblings. The intersection of moral responsibility, legal obligation, and familial loyalty is rarely straightforward, and this case illustrates the heavy burden of navigating these intersecting pressures. Even as the public focused on legal judgments, the private reality remained deeply painful. The surviving siblings, extended family members, and friends had to reconcile their grief with ongoing media scrutiny, moral judgments, and the challenge of rebuilding their lives after such a profound disruption. And as the Reiner family attempted to move forward, the case continued to serve as a stark cautionary tale. Wealth, privilege, and social status do not insulate families from conflict, violence, or tragedy. The psychological pressures inherent in familial relationships, when left unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences that reverberate for generations. The story of the Reiners, while publicized for its shocking legal and emotional elements, is ultimately a deeply human one. It exposes the fragility of trust, the dangers of unresolved conflict, and the complex interplay between love, loyalty, and accountability. And while the legal process may have concluded for now, the emotional and relational aftermath will continue to unfold, shaping the lives of the surviving family members in ways that cannot be reversed. In the wake of the verdicts and sentencing, the Reiner family faced the complex task of reconstructing daily life under a shadow they could never have imagined. The estate, once a symbol of privacy and security, now carried memories of violence, betrayal, and loss. Every room, every corridor, every quiet space became a reminder of the events that had irreversibly altered their lives. For Romy, the daughter who discovered the tragedy, the psychological toll was profound. Experts note that surviving such trauma often produces a range of emotional responses: survivor's guilt, anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance. In Romy's case, identifying a dangerous family member compounded these feelings, creating a complex mix of grief and responsibility. She had to reconcile her role in alerting authorities with the devastating consequences for her siblings and herself. Tracy's life, meanwhile, was permanently changed. Being convicted as an accomplice meant her future would be dictated not only by the sentence she received, but by the social ramifications of her conviction. The combination of public scrutiny, legal restriction, and personal guilt created an environment of intense psychological stress. Research in family trauma suggests that individuals in such positions often experience long-term impacts on relationships, self-perception, and trust. Nick, now incarcerated, faced the dual reality of serving time while processing the emotional fallout of his actions and the public narrative surrounding them. The isolation of prison, combined with ongoing media attention, placed additional pressure on his mental health. Experts studying high-profile cases emphasize that individuals in these situations often confront a unique form of stress, where personal accountability and public judgment collide. Beyond the immediate family, extended relatives and close friends were forced to navigate their own grief while witnessing the public dissection of intimate family dynamics. For many, the exposure of private disputes, internal tensions, and familial roles magnified the trauma, illustrating how public scrutiny can intensify private suffering. Therapists working with families who experience intrafamily violence highlight key themes that often emerge: the dangers of unaddressed tension, the escalation of unresolved conflicts, and the critical importance of communication and intervention. In the Reiner case, the combination of physical proximity, wealth, and a culture of privacy may have allowed small conflicts to grow unchecked, culminating in tragedy. Legal experts also point to the significance of complicity charges in shaping family dynamics after the fact. When one family member is accused or convicted as an accomplice, the surviving relatives are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, responsibility, and moral choice. These dynamics can fracture relationships further as siblings and relatives navigate blame, grief, and accountability. The Reiner estate itself serves as a physical reminder of both privilege and vulnerability. The architectural separation of the guest house and main residence, once intended for convenience and independence, may have unintentionally facilitated circumstances that contributed to the crime. Spatial proximity, combined with emotional distance, can create environments where conflict is observed but not mediated, a dynamic that appears to have played a role in this tragedy. Public reaction, meanwhile, remained intense. Media outlets and social platforms dissected every aspect of the family's history, the timeline of the crime, and the courtroom proceedings. The intersection of fame, wealth, and violence created a narrative that was irresistible to the public, but emotionally devastating to the family involved. This level of attention often compounds trauma, making the process of recovery more difficult and extending the period of emotional upheaval. One of the most profound lessons from the Reiner case is the interplay between visibility and privacy. Publicly, the family was seen as stable, accomplished, and harmonious. Privately, however, internal conflicts, unresolved tensions, and unspoken resentments created conditions ripe for escalation. This dichotomy underscores the importance of vigilance, communication, and intervention in all families, regardless of social status or wealth. In the months and years following the trial, the Reiners were confronted with the ongoing challenge of navigating daily life while processing a tragedy that will forever define their family story. Emotional recovery is neither linear nor complete. Instead, it unfolds gradually, influenced by ongoing reflection, therapy, and adaptation to new realities. And as the family continues to grapple with the aftermath, the broader implications of the case remain relevant. Unresolved conflicts can escalate. Proximity can facilitate both care and danger, and silence, when combined with high stakes, can produce irreversible consequences. The tragedy of the Reiners is not just a headline. It is a case study in human psychology, family dynamics, and the devastating intersection of privilege, secrecy, and violence. It is a story that reminds us how fragile relationships can be and how the decisions we make, or fail to make, echo far beyond the immediate moment.